At the beginning of the semester, we chose to take this class because of the interest we had in the subject. We are interested in world history and the events that come with it, specifically, the genocides of the 20th century. But personally, we did not have a clear idea about the definition of the concept of genocide itself and the implications that come with it. We also wanted to learn about specific events that related with genocide throughout history. So, starting the class, this was one of the quotes that we first heard, and it was quite shocking because it was very blunt and very direct. I quote, "We are not going to leave a single one of them alive, down to the babies in their mother wombs. Not even they must live. The whole people must be wiped out of existence, and none be left to think of them and shed a tear." This was such an impact to visualize the topic that we were getting into.
By the time class took place, we started to get awareness and have considerations about this type of crimes. Plus, we were able to see how variables such as social hierarchy, discrimination, ethnic differences, political disagreements, and conflict of interest could escalate to the point of destroying an entire population. Our perspective of the concept of genocide changed because it made us realize that there has been a lot of theorization, discussion, and debates about it, but it's not something fixed yet. Additionally, the amplitude of the concept is what allowed us to understand that genocide can mean various actions that end up in the partial or total destruction of a group, and that does not exclusively mean direct killing. It can also include targeting leaders to weaken the social cohesion of the group, destroying religious symbols, or cultural, the use of sexual violence, especially rape and forced pregnancy, among other options that contribute to the destruction. This means that our previous idea of the concept of genocide was pretty limited, and throughout the class we could explore a little bit more about what it means and different events on the story. We ended up understanding why the Resolution 96 in the General Assembly refers to genocide as a denial of a right of existence of an entire human group. It's the realization that genocide is not simply a repetitive and massive act of killing. The topic of sexual violence and the extensive examples of it in genocides showed us a way in which the racial or religious aspects play a role in the identity of a group and the persons in it. The kinship or the family relationships are very important in determining the sense of the belonging of individuals to a group. This is one of the reasons as why this sexual violence has been effectively used by perpetrators in the genocide events to partake in the destruction of certain groups. It also showed that particularly women's bodies, although there are also male victims, have been used throughout history as a tool or an object to fulfill their intentions and cause harm among the receptive group.
Regarding the prevention of genocide, we learned that often the international community and the mechanisms to address and to prevent genocide have been insufficient. However, we recognize that in many situations, it has been difficult to reach agreements and to make decisions between the different states and in international organizations as a whole, as has happened in the United Nations. Having seen and understood the structure of the UN and how their assemblies work, our perspective about the neutrality of international organizations changed. For example, we understand that the state members of the UN each have their own political and economical interests. So it is important to take that into account because the possibility of a completely unbiased decision does not exist, especially taking into account the way in which the Security Council works and the veto power that the 5 permanent members have. However, the creation of peace agreements and alliances has helped maintain peace in many situations. Before we took this class, we didn't realize there were such tensions and uncertainties regarding the responsibility of states to prevent genocide. First, the tension between the protection of human rights and the sovereignty of states is always present, and is one of the aspects that make it difficult to intervene during these violations and genocidal events. Secondly, after reading the text about the legal duty to prevent genocide by Eyal Mayros, we realized that the responsibilities and the obligations of the state to prevent genocide were not always clear since the Genocide Convention of 1948. There have been legal uncertainties about what preventing means, at what moment should the states act to prevent or to stop a genocide, and for how long does this responsibility count after the genocide has commenced. On the other side, it is very evident that most of the legal actions and the responses from the international community have taken place after the genocides occurred. After studying all of these genocides throughout the semester, we realized that many of these events were preventable, but they were not prevented and they ended up happening. So what is left is to seek justice through the international courts and the international justice system to try to reach compensation for the victims and punishment for the perpetrators. But only some of the perpetrators responsible for these violent crimes have been sentenced, and the process of the trials and convictions has been very slow in most cases, taking many years. Also, as we learned in class, the International Criminal Court has been criticized for trialing only third world countries, which makes us question if powerful countries really take accountability for their actions and can be punished, or if their position allows them to get away with different actions, like this type of crimes, or being silent about human rights violations in other countries.
The history of how international organizations, no matter how much they have the intention of peace, fails. We have, for instance, the League of Nations, focused on Europe and American issues, at the same time when Armenian and Hero genocides were happening in Asian and African countries. So, from the beginning it failed because it was given a bias from the truly international reality. Then, its predecessor, the UN, it's much more global. However, since the notion of sovereignty of the states and the law of non-intervention prevails, there will be no 100% guarantee other than absolute peace. In general, there is a great difficulty in preventing genocide. The responsibility that countries have to prevent it is limited because it has never been clear what they are supposed to do. It is almost ironic that it's in order to justify that there is a genocide, you have to go through the Supreme Court to say that there is a genocide, and while the process is being carried out, there is no enough time to act. Preventing it's difficult because you don't know it's happening until it starts happening. Recognition comes also as a delayment to prevent an act over it, since the fact that external organizations qualify certain events as genocide, but then, by the same sovereignty, they must recognize that the consideration of the international entities and see if they recognize it or not. For instance, after more than 100 years, Biden was the first US president to recognize the Armenian genocide as such. So, beyond waiting for the court's consideration, one must also wait for the state's recognition of such a crime. The same difficulty required to intervene in a state makes penalties at the economic, political, social, and military level. In case it happens again, not only the image of the state would be affected, but it would also be reflected in the relationships they have internationally. We're talking about financial fees, restriction on diplomatic representations, and even economic blockades. So, as a punishment of the action would affect multidimensionally, those are the greatest protection we have to prevent genocide.